From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 2 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
There's a world of investment opportunities out there. Spotting them takes experts on the ground, assessing potential firsthand. Templeton, a pioneer in global investing for over 50 years. Gain from our perspective.
If. For such a small word, it packs a wallop. If I live to 100, if Social Security isn't enough, if my heart gets broken, if she says yes. We believe if should never hold you back. If should be managed with a plan that builds on what you already have. Together, we can create a personal safety net, a launching pad for all those brilliant ifs in the middle of life. You can call on our expertise and get guarantees for the if in life. After all, we're MetLife.
Issue 1, the UN, 65 years young.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world. History will honor you for it.
Harry S. Truman, the 33rd U.S. President, delivered these remarks on June 26, 1945, 65 years ago this month, when the United Nations Charter was signed by 50 nations. That was the birth of the UN. In fewer than 50 years, the world has seen 2 horrible conflicts, World War I and World War II. The goal of the United Nations is to stop wars such as these. Quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, are determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights." Unquote. The UN Charter was signed in San Francisco, June 26, 1945. It also states, quote, "The organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members," unquote. So, this means that all nations are equal in the eyes of the UN, echoing the Treaty of Westphalia, regardless of differences in wealth, territory, power, or status. Truman embraced the UN cause after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who coined the title United Nations. Truman signed 2 months after the defeat of the Nazis in Europe, 2 months before Japan's surrender, and 2 months after the death of Roosevelt.
Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in Japan, in this most destructive of all wars, you have won a victory against war itself.
Question. The UN was founded to be a democratic forum. Smaller nations are supposed to have an equal say with larger nations. Has it worked out that way, Pat Buchanan?
No, and it wasn't even begun that way. There's a General Assembly and there's a Security Council of 15 nations, 5 permanent members. Truman, Churchill, Stalin did not give away their freedom of action in the Security Council, John. Each had a veto, as all 5 permanent members do. And right after the UN was started, of course, we were into the Cold War. Stalin used his veto. Eventually, the Communist Chinese did. And so as a result, war was prevented by an American atomic nuclear arsenal, NATO alliance, Americans fighting in Korea, a war 5 years after that war ended. And so the Cold War lasted. As for the General Assembly, John, that has really turned into an anti-American body of people who've got one thing in common. They all get foreign aid, and they all have grievances against us. Frankly, it ought to be shut down as a public nuisance.
So you're saying that an Anglo-American alliance would dominate this so-called world equal order arrangement?
Early in the Cold War, the Anglo-American alliance and the French did indeed dominate it. And Stalin was hostile, but in the General Assembly, the Communist bloc, quite frankly, got a growing strength there until the anti-Americans dominate the General Assembly today, as they did through the later days of the Cold War.
So, and they knew that at the start, and that's the way they wanted it?
No, they didn't know that at the start. What they did know is, the big powers, we are not giving up our main core of power to any General Assembly. All of us have a veto.
Mm-hmm. And now the smaller nations can go in there, and they have a forum for authoritarian governments that's impregnable, correct? I mean, Cuba can go in and say, we want to be treated as an equal.
I shudder to think we just got a preview of Pat Buchanan's next book on the
exposing the UN.
Exposing the UN. It is a body where everybody comes together, and it is perfectly fine for us to listen to the grievances of other countries. With the globe is getting smaller, we have a lot of shared issues: climate change, water scarcity, health issues. And if the UN did not exist, as imperfect as it is, we would be clamoring to create it. And it's also a place where serious issues of war and peace still do get discussed, if not resolved. I mean, the most recent altercation between North Korea and South Korea, Japan, China, the UN, you don't want a war between South Korea and North Korea, but you do want a place where countries can come together and discuss it. And the UN serves that function, especially as NATO and other regional alliances, even the EU, are beginning to struggle with what their place is in the changing world. The UN is more necessary now than ever before, not only for all those other nations, but for us as well.
The United Nations is a corrupt, putrid organization that has the most perverse priorities and engages in the worst kind of moral relativism in the face of genocide, tyranny, and terrorism, and in some cases even supports those things. Let's look at a quick record of the UN just in their most recent times. They are unable to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. They have been unable to stop North Korea from getting a nuclear weapon. They were unable to stop Russia from invading a neighbor in Georgia and allowing Russia to annex 2 provinces of a sovereign state. They were unable to stop the genocide in Rwanda. They were unable to stop the genocide in Darfur. And let's talk for a second about the Oil for Food program, which was a UN program meant to help the Iraqi people under the jackboot of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was able to play that like a piano, like a Stradivarius, got hundreds of billions of dollars out of the Oil for Food program. This is an incredibly anti-American and anti-Israeli organization that has its priorities completely screwed up.
One sentence.
I'd like a sentence too. Eleanor, please. No, it is my turn.
No, I want to say one thing, and that is I want to thank Monica for being so generous and blaming the UN for all these things, because normally she would blame President Obama.
They
so thank you.
Under the auspices of the United Nations, and it failed.
One of the factors and Monica's display of erudition here is that the UN has to respect the sovereignty of nations. And these are all nations that are involved. But it has to respect the sovereignty of nations. So there really are limitations as to what it can do. Should she assign as much blame as she has?
Well, there is a problem that I think was properly highlighted, which is that in many ways they rationalize a lot of things that are going on in the world that aren't very popular or very attractive. Nevertheless, I still think they have the UN has a real value, and that is it is a forum and it is a place where people do get together and talk without having to organize it and make all the political compromises in order to have those conversations. Sometimes those conversations lead nowhere, and most of the time they don't, as Monica points out, and sometimes they're more productive. So I think it has a valuable role, but it is not an essential role.
Here's a point that's being made in the June 2010 issue of Harper's Magazine by John Gray, a professor at the London School of Economics. He makes the case that the UN today is, quote, a forum for nationalism, meaning that authoritarian states use the UN to assert their right to self-governance free of external constraints or demands, particularly regarding human rights under the guise of Wilsonian self-determination. Which goes to, I think, to your point.
John,
go ahead.
You got a very good point here. First, I agree with Eleanor on this. It is a good forum. If you have a Cuban Missile Crisis, you can dump something in there. But here's the point. The UN can now intervene, John, and override sovereignty in cases where allegedly genocide or enormous human rights violations are taking place, like Rwanda and places like that. It is asserted to itself that right, but overall, the sovereignty issue
Exit question we got to get out. Will the UN evolve into world government? Yes or no?
Not as long as we have a National Rifle Association, John.
No, and John, I don't even think that's a debate they're having in law schools around the country, but I don't think the fact that it's not going to be a world government does not take away from its essential value in the world today.
No, it's not going to lead to a world government. And all you have to do is look at what's happening to the European Union right now, where the wheels are coming off and states like Germany are asserting their sovereignty because they don't want to be held hostage by other states like Greece. There's no way, and this was the fatal flaw of the UN to begin with, there's no way that sovereign states will ever give up their national interests in favor of some sort of global agenda. And that's also why the United Nations, the Security Council, is so often locked, and why they are unable or unwilling to take on humanitarian
we got the point. Does that mean you're ruling out a world court?
There already is a world court.
There's a couple.
You mean the Hague?
Yes, yes.
There's an international.
There are a couple
court.
of them. They already exist in the United States, and other countries resist it because they don't want to cede their sovereignty to organizations like this that are fundamentally anti-American.
Do you regard the Hague as a true world court?
I don't know what you mean by a true world court. There are certain issues that can be brought before the Hague. Not every issue can be brought. And I'll tell you, it has moral authority and it has some legal consequences. And I would say that's true of the United Nations. It may not have political authority. It has a certain moral authority that people are concerned about, even in the worst of countries.
It also has a wonderful humanitarian history. With these various councils that it has, the food for peace, that kind of stuff.
But John,
this is true, is that not? Rwanda didn't work.
John, I got to correct you on this. Over the last couple of weeks, the United Nations has appointed Iran to sit on the Women's Rights Council and Libya to sit on its Human Rights Council. Come on.
It may be that we will have to have a better world court than the Hague. That aside, I don't think that the UN will become a world court or any kind of a world governing body. Issue 2, ditch of debt.
I happen to believe it's one of the critical challenges before us. Our nation has to be strong fiscally at home in order for us to be strong abroad. You've got countries who are explicitly saying to me in private, well, look, you know, we always look to you because you had this great economy, and now look, you're in the ditch.
The ditch Secretary of State Clinton refers to is debt. The ditch of debt. It's now an all-time record. The current national debt is $12 trillion. By the end of 2011, $14 trillion. Why? Government spending. 60 years ago, federal, state, and local spending, that's all public spending, was 1/4 of the economy, 25%. Today, it's 44%, nearly half of the economy. Where's the money coming from that the government is going to spend? Not from the standard sources. Item, income tax revenues down. Not even half of all American households pay any income taxes, 47%. Item, getting more than giving. Every 3 out of 5 Americans get more in government benefits than they pay in all government taxes. 60%. Item, debt to GDP ratio. The size of all U.S. debt will shortly equal the size of the entire U.S. economy, a ratio of 100%. Republican Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, believes that the fourth financial bubble to burst after the internet, after the housing market, after Wall Street, will be the U.S. government itself.
We can't sustain having government as the fourth bubble where we are spending more than we can possibly maintain.
Question, is the U.S. ripe for a reform of federal tax laws, Mort?
Well, sure we are. We absolutely need a reform of federal tax laws in order to raise more revenue, and we have to have a reform of federal programs in order to cut our costs, because we're heading down a very, very dangerous road in terms of the accumulation of the federal debt. It is bound to have enormous consequences for us on every level, not just in terms of international strength, as Hillary Clinton was pointing out, but just in terms of the growth of our economy and the welfare of our people. And what is more, we have a government that doesn't work, because one set of politicians don't want to raise taxes, and the other set doesn't want to cut expenditures. That's a formula for disaster, and it's going to happen sooner. We saw what happened in Europe with Greece and all of the countries in the southern arc of Europe, where they have a huge problem, where they have fiscal deficits and they have no ability to raise the money to cover it. We, for the moment, have that ability, but that ability is going to stay with us forever.
What do you want the Obama administration to do that it's not doing?
Well, I want the Obama administration to do 2 things. 1 is to increase taxes, and 2 is to cut expenditures. either one of the two things. They haven't done either, really, as a practical matter.
If they let the Bush tax cuts go lapse, which they could well do, taxes will go up, John. But clearly what we need to do is we need to change our tax code to tax consumption more and savings and production and investment less. Frankly, you get a tariff or even a national sales tax. If you could do away with income taxes on small business, best thing that could happen in the United States.
The thing is that
that would be helpful.
The short-term spending that we're seeing now is designed to get us out of the recession, and it is necessary. And I think politically, people have found it convenient to conflate the stimulus spending with the long-term structural. This president is serious, I think, about reducing the debt because he sees just what that setup explained, that we're headed for disaster. But you can't, now is not the time to pull back on spending. It will just sink us back into the ditch again.
I think the administration needs to do a couple of things, but I'm not confident that they will do any of them. First, when you mentioned that nearly half of the American people pay no taxes at all, I think that is an abomination. I think that every American
no income taxes. I think that every American should pay something because they are getting a collective good out of all of the goods and services provided by the government at all levels. That's number one. Number two, tax cuts. Here I disagree with Mort. I think if you want to really encourage economic growth and if you want to really encourage job creation in this country, there have to be tax cuts across the board at the individual and corporate level, especially for small businesses.
Is the Obama administration floating the idea of value-added tax?
Well, we've heard of that idea. I don't know that they are floating any idea that involves higher taxes.
Do you think a value-added tax would do much?
I think it would do a lot, actually.
A lot of money.
It would raise a lot of money.
And every 1 point raises $100 billion, John. But that, again, is a tax on production.
A value-added tax is just that. It is a tax, and it would stifle growth and put us into this long-term stagnation like we're seeing in Europe, where they have upwards of 20-30% value-added tax.
It would spread it around.
You've got to cut taxes if you want growth and job creation,
everybody
John.
pays a value-added tax. Well, so that wouldn't help the poorer classes, would it?
If you were making the argument that you will replace the federal income tax and state income taxes with a value-added tax, that's an argument that you can make, but that's not the argument that the Democrats are making.
From God's lips to our ears.
I'm just wondering if God's telling us he doesn't want us to drill offshore, and maybe you know, the Lord's tired of having the mountains of West Virginia, the tops knocked off of them so they can get more coal. I think
media mogul billionaire Ted Turner says that God may be sending a message to the U.S. We must end America's addiction to coal and oil. Well, easier said than done, Ted. Coal and oil are the U.S.'s two foremost sources of energy. Coal is the #1 producer of U.S. electricity, yielding over 50% of it. As for U.S. vehicles, over 225 million of them use oil. Yet, Turner suggests it's time for America to set aside coal and oil. He says this because of two major disasters. Big Branch Mine. A coal mine in West Virginia exploded, killing 29 miners, the worst coal disaster in 40 years. Gulf of Mexico, the massive oil leak in the Gulf. So, Mr. Turner, what should the U.S. government do? If you could write a legislative bill that would deal with America's energy usage, what should it be based on?
I think that the kind of bill that I want was take Boone Pickens. I'm a subscriber to the Pickens Plan.
The Pickens Plan is named after oil tycoon and billionaire T. Boone Pickens. It calls for a major shift away from coal and oil. The centerpiece of Pickens' plan is natural gas. Pickens urges natural gas to replace coal, including replacing oil and gasoline in cars and trucks. Pickens says natural gas is cleaner, cheaper, and in abundance in the U.S.
We have natural gas, which is 130 octane fuel. It's cleaner by 30% than diesel. Get on it, use it. It's great for heavy-duty trucks. That's what we should use it for. Mm-hmm. If we put all 8 million heavy-duty trucks in the United States on natural gas, we'd cut OPEC in half.
Question, should natural gas be substituted for oil and coal, Monica?
I think he makes a very strong argument here because natural gas, we've got enormous domestic resources, so it's right here at home. It's cleaner than the fossil fuels that we're all using, and it's a lot safer too than a lot of this stuff in terms of environmental consequences. So I think he does make a very interesting argument. The challenge here, and I know he's taken it on, is changing the whole infrastructure and getting all of these vehicles, starting with the heavy trucks, but then going to light trucks and then cars. Because do you know that 2/3 of all of the imported fuel coming from the Persian Gulf into the United States is used for transportation?
You can't buy.
That's his point.
The natural gas distributors, there are none, I don't think, in Washington, D.C. Maybe 2 at most. And you've got to really hunt them out.
Well,
when are we going to get a distribution system for natural gas?
We won't get a distribution plan until we have the resources and the application for it. And Boone Pickens is absolutely right. Amongst other things, we've got to reduce our dependence on foreign oil sources.
But we apparently have abundant natural gas.
Yes, exactly.
Why don't you have these things now? The reason is it's because gasoline made from oil is the most economical, it works best, it's most efficient. That's why we have this. Look, if you could run cars on natural gas cheaper, they would be running there right now.
You think big oil wants natural gas?
Sure, a lot of them are into gas.
Big oil?
Sure, oil and gas.
Well, the Pickens plan actually was kind of popular during the campaign. He met with both the presidential candidates, and he's now on Capitol Hill lobbying behind the scenes for the climate change bill that's up there.
That was windmills.
It's all part of his whole plan. He wants a whole transference, and you need infrastructure to support windmills just as you do to support natural gas.
Are you behind natural gas?
I'm behind alternative fuels, and I'm behind the climate change bill that's emerging on the Hill. And when you say one of the reasons why we don't have this, it's because we can't pass that bill.
You mean photovoltaic cells, which we've been fooling around with for 30 years and have still not moved very much from their original form? Issue 4, mission to nowhere.
This budget proposal presents no challenges, has no focus, and is in fact a blueprint for a mission to nowhere.
This acid testimony to Congress by astronaut Eugene Cernan echoed the feelings of fellow astronauts Neil Armstrong and Jim Lovell. They all deplored the ending of manned space flights. They warned that if NASA loses ground on the world stage, other countries will rush in to fill the void. But President Obama rejects the idea of another moon landing. In fact, he sees 25 years elapsing before man is returned to outer space in U.S. capsules, except for 3 trips to the space station, one of which has just taken place. But after 25 years, Obama says, there is BL, Beyond Luna, and Man in Space.
By the mid-2030s, I believe we can send humans to orbit Mars and return them safely to Earth. And a landing on Mars will follow, and I expect to be around to see it.
Why did Mr. Obama gut NASA's budget for space travel, Pat?
I don't think he's got the real vision and the imagination that we had back in the 1960s with Kennedy, John. And the idea that we're going to use Russian rockets to send our guys up to a space station we built, and the Chinese are going to be walking on the moon in the future. I mean, what's happened to this country, quite frankly, is we've adopted sort of the welfare state idea of Europe, and we've given up all these things that we had when we were a young nation that could really do things.
Oh, come on. I don't see anything wrong with having the Chinese walk on the moon if they want to get there. It's not our particular province. We've been to the moon already. We have severe budget deficits, and on other issues, you and a lot of conservatives are screaming about the deficits, yet you want to spend money on a program, the Constellation program, that's full of cost overruns, wasn't going to be able to make it anyway, to repeat a mission that we've already done. This is reorienting the NASA budget to fit the times and looking ahead towards Mars. It's not slashing
no man in space for 25 years.
Right.
Do you think it is? Do you think it is the DNA of man to constantly seek fresh horizons
and new pastures and new frontiers? Absolutely. And Obama said throughout the campaign that John F. Kennedy was one of his big political heroes. JFK is spinning in his grave at this announcement. And by the way, JFK announced we put a man on the moon. We did that in a handful of years. Obama's projections of 20, 30 years down the road, I think, are outrageous, on top of the fact that we just had the last space shuttle launch. And I agree with Pat, we are ceding space to the Russians and the Chinese at a time when our economy and national security is so dependent on satellites.
Do you think that there is a possibility of an asteroid striking the Earth and do what happened when the dinosaurs disappeared?
You know, I think
it happened before.
I think that is possible, actually. I mean, I would have to say, unlike what the president said, not in my lifetime. That's all I'm asking. I think there's a very, very low probability of that, and nothing that we're doing in space is going to prevent that. And frankly, there isn't a single program that if anybody tries to cut that doesn't have a constituency.
Okay, a multi-planet species.
Some scientists, reputable ones, believe that over the very long term, humans can only survive if they become a multi-planet species. That's right, multi-planet, moving to another planet. The existing problems include Earth's population growth, environmental degradation, and finite physical resources. But there is another problem, collision. Collision with a comet, or large asteroid, or maybe another ice age that would bury Earth beneath 2 miles of ice. 2 historians have written that human civilization may have at most a few centuries to become a truly spacefaring species. Quote, beyond that period, it's plausible that humanity will not have the collective wealth to support sustained space exploration and colonization, unquote, as reported by Peter Spotts of the Christian Science Monitor.
What's the probability of mankind having to save itself from extinction by traveling to another planet? What's the probability scale of his being obliged to do that quickly? 1 out of 10?
Is that before or after we get the VAT tax? I'm not going to worry about it now.
This is much after we get the VAT tax. Zero.
I worry about a lot of things. You'd be surprised how little I worry about that one.
When Elaine Kagan is voted by for the Supreme Court by the United States Senate, which has 100 votes, how many negative votes will she receive?
Over 30.
She'll receive 68 positive votes.
35 against.
35 against?
35 against.
Only about 25 against.
24 against. Don't forget to friend us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Bye-bye.
Investing takes perspective. It comes from navigating up and down markets for 60 years, spotting opportunities at home and abroad. Global investing from Franklin Templeton Investments. Gain from our perspective.